Join us as we impact our world by opening God's Word to today's minds. You'll learn that God's way is always best. Lamentations of Jeremiah. So it's right after the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is one of the major prophets, so it's a longer book in the Old Testament. Lamentations is at the end of that. Last Sunday evening, we were looking at the book of 2 Kings in our Route 66 series, and we learned that 2 Kings is a book of dispersion. It's a book that records for us the continual decline of both of the kingdoms that split into two in 1 Kings. 1 Kings was the book of disruption, and we saw the kingdom divide into two. 2 Kings is the book of dispersion, and the divided kingdom, each of the two kingdoms continued to go further and further away from God till finally God sent both of them into slavery, the northern kingdom to the Assyrians and the southern kingdom to the Chaldeans or the Babylonians. And so the book of 2 Kings ended with the southern kingdom being conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. It's a very sad read as Nebuchadnezzar came in and to read of the atrocities, the siege of the city. The women inside of Jerusalem ended up eating their children because of the horrendous starvation. They were worshiping any god that held out any hope of rescuing them from Nebuchadnezzar's horrible siege against the city of Jerusalem. And then finally, the Babylonians were able to breach their wall, and then they plundered, they murdered, they plundered. It took them a month, I think it was, to plunder the city, and then they began to tear the city down. They tore down the king's house, they tore down the temple, They tore down every major building, and then they began to tear the walls of the city down so it would not easily be rebuilt. And it was just a horrendous, horrendous ordeal. It was the horrible end of apostasy of the southern kingdom. Well, Jeremiah was a preacher who lived at that time. Unlike Daniel and Ezekiel, those two young men were taken captive in earlier raids of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. They were drugged back across the sands to Babylon, and they ended up growing up and ministering there in Babylon to the captive Jews that had been taken into slavery and taken to Babylon. But Jeremiah was different. Jeremiah was left in Jerusalem, and Jeremiah hid in a cave, and Jeremiah watched the horrible, horrible things that happened in his capital city. He watched the soldiers murder. He watched what they did to the women. He watched what they did to the children. He watched what they did to the city. And as he watched them tear, I've often thought, as I've thought of Jeremiah sitting in the mouth of that cave, watching what they were doing, I've often thought of what it would be like to be over near Washington, D.C., and to be hid up in a secret place across the Potomac River, and to watch a foreign power come in and murder and abuse the people of America, to watch them tear the Washington Monument down, to watch the Capitol dome implode and come crashing down, to watch the White House go up in flames. What would I feel like as I watched a foreign power decimate my capital city of my country? And I've thought of Jeremiah many times sitting there watching the horrible atrocity. And then he wrote a series of funeral dirges, funeral songs. He wrote a series of laments, of weepings. And we have it in our Bible as the Lamentations of Jeremiah, his funeral songs about the horrible death of the southern kingdom. It's interesting, he went back to the book of Deuteronomy hundreds of years before, and he reminded them of what God said he would do if they worshiped other gods. He reminded them that what they had experienced was exactly what God told them he would do in Deuteronomy 28. And he reminded them, you got exactly what God told you he would do. And then he appealed to them to repent, that they could have the blessings of Deuteronomy chapter 30. A God that is merciful, a God that is full of grace, a God that will forgive and restore. And so these songs are very difficult songs of weeping and lament over what had happened that he had watched. Now I want you to look in chapter 3. Here's one little portion of Jeremiah's lament. I'm going to start reading in verse number 40. Verse number 40. Let us search and try our ways and turn again to the Lord. Let us lift up our heart with our hands unto God in the heavens. We have transgressed and have rebelled. Thou hast not pardoned. Thou hast covered with anger and persecuted us. Thou hast slain. Thou hast not pitied. Thou hast covered thyself with a cloud that our prayer should not pass through. Thou hast made us as the offscouring and the refuse in the midst of the people. All our enemies have opened their mouths against us. Fear and a snare is come upon us. Desolation and destruction. Mine eye runneth down with rivers of water for the destruction of the daughter of my people. He said, I am just weeping. Flooding down, coursing down my cheeks are rivers of water for the women. what I saw them do to our women, what they did to our daughters, how they abused our children, our females, our daughters. I am weeping rivers of water. Mine eye trickled down and ceaseth not, without any intermission, till the Lord looked down and behold from heaven. Mine eye affecteth mine heart because of all the daughters of my city. What Jeremiah saw impacted him to the core of his being. What he saw, he said, affecteth mine heart. That word affecteth has an element of torture in it, in its original usage. It had an element of torture. My eyes have tortured my heart. My eyes have affected my heart. My eyes have just attacked my heart. My heart is grieving in agony because of what I watched them do to our women, what they did to our city, what they did to our country. I have cried until I am filled with pain and agony. My emotions are raw. What I saw has impacted my heart. You know, it's that way. What we see does impact our heart, does it not? What is vision? Well, vision is what you see, right? Vision is your ability to see. You have vision and you can see things. And what you see creates a vision. Because we use vision of looking to something in the future. A vision for something, a vision for accomplishment, a vision of what I'd like to see happen, a vision of what this year might hold. What I see with my vision impacts my heart so painfully that it creates within me a vision for what I want to see happen in the future. We've chosen this year as our theme for our church, for our calendar year from mission conference to mission conference. What does your heart see? Jeremiah cried out, "Mine eye affecteth mine heart." A verse that has probably been used as often as any other verse in the Bible at missions revivals and missions conferences. As missionaries and pastors appeal to a generation of Christians to see what God sees. To see through the eyes of God so that what you see will impact your heart feelings, because it's your emotion that motivates your action. What you see impacts your heart. What your heart feels impacts the decisions you make in life. It's always that way. What we see has to so impact our hearts and how we feel that we will make decisions to do things we would have never done had we not felt what we felt. And we would have never felt that way had we not seen what we saw. Lamentations would not be in our Bible if Jeremiah hadn't sat in that cave and watched the atrocities that were committed in the judgment of God because of an apostate nation of idol worshipers. And so as we see with our vision, as we see the picture of Mike and Madeline Johns at the Gospel Truth Baptist Church in Arkansas and realize we don't buy that building. There are high school kids that are struggling through the addictions of drugs and alcohol that Mike and Madeline are desperately trying to reach. And if we see something, all of a sudden it impacts the way we feel. to see those pictures of those kids on the Syrian border in the refugee camps, to realize those kids in the midst of a harsh winter living in tents with no heat or very little heat of any kind, some of them with no socks to wear, going through icy cold waters of flood waters and snow runoff, and they don't even have any socks. They don't even have a blanket to wrap around them to try to hold off the cold. We see, look into the eyes of those kids. What does that do? Mine eye affects my heart. Sometimes it's the hearing. We hear of a need and we're moved. We see a need and we're moved. And it's the moving of our hearts, the effect that it has on our hearts, that calls us to make the decisions we make. And so when the Gondermans come and tell their story, and we see their media presentation, and we have the opportunity to see with our eyes, and then all of a sudden our hearts begin to feel for the people of Australia. We don't have anyone in Australia we're supporting. Currently we supported thank you, the Harris family for a number of years, and then they decided to go off mission support, and they canceled all their mission support, and he just became the pastor of the church there. And we haven't supported anyone in Australia for a number of years. We'll have the opportunity now to have a partner in Australia that we're actively funding. We'll meet the Troel family and find out what it is about the Muslims that have captivated their hearts. What is it about the Muslim people that have, in his heart and in his mind, they're no longer enemies. They're souls for which Jesus Christ hung on a cross and died. And if somebody doesn't get the gospel to them, they'll die and go to hell. We'll see his media, we'll hear him tell stories about Middle Eastern countries where he has evangelized and worked to plant churches. And what we see with our eyes will impact our hearts. What does our heart see? What does our heart see? Because what our heart sees impacts the lives that we live. We all make decisions based on how we feel. We all feel the way we feel based on what we've seen and heard of the needs of people and country and people groups. We'll hear from the Mategs of what it is that has so captivated their hearts for the international community around Toronto. Toronto's one of the great international communities of the world, and the mixture of all the cultures and all the peoples from around the world that came to Canada and ended up in Toronto. And he's burdened to reach people of various ethnic groups within the Toronto area. And we'll catch a glimpse, we'll see with our eyes, we'll listen to the stories that he tells for one purpose, that our eyes might affect our hearts. And if our eyes do affect our hearts, maybe God will lay on our hearts something that he wants us to do to make an impact, make a difference in those international communities in Toronto. We'll learn again about Trinidad and Brother Rasmussen and what they've done there in Trinidad. Each of these countries will represent for us opportunities that will be able to have fruit that will abound to our account, people groups that we will have a role in reaching with the gospel. And it all begins with vision, with what our heart sees as we listen to missionary stories, as we see missionary presentations. God impacted my life growing up at Bethlehem Baptist Church here in Northern Virginia. Bethlehem Baptist Church, at the time in which my mom and dad and my siblings and I grew up there, was one of the great missions churches in America. Missionaries all over the world that were supported by the members of Bethlehem Baptist Church. Members who left America to go and become those missionaries. I remember as a kid growing up at Bethlehem Baptist Church, I remember watching slide presentation after slide presentation after slide presentation. And you know what it did to me as a boy growing up? I'm so glad my mom and dad made sure I never missed any service of Bethlehem Baptist Church. And as a little boy sitting there, whether it's a Sunday morning or a Sunday night or a Wednesday night, or whether it was a missions conference or a revival meeting, but particularly the mission conferences. As I sat there as a little boy and watched those slides and saw those faces and saw those parts of the world, God burdened my heart. As a little boy growing up, I remember wanting to be a missionary. I remember wondering, what if God would let me be a missionary? I remember the night that I knew in my heart God had called me to be involved in ministry at a pastoral or a missionary level. I remember the night. It was a Sunday night. And I remember the joy that flooded over my soul when I knew that night that my dream had come true. That what I had wondered, could God use me? Could God let me be a missionary? And I remember the night that I knew God called me to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. A joy. I turned to the person beside me and I said, God called me. And I went forward on this side of the auditorium and I got on my knees at an altar. And I gave my heart and life to Jesus Christ. And I said, I'll go anywhere that you want me to go. I enrolled in Bible college to prepare for the ministry, and I took the missions program because I was convinced that God was going to send me to the mission field. He didn't really do that, with the exception that every place is a mission field. I never went on deputation and put together a partnership team and to go to a different culture. I went to Canada. People say, well, what's Canada like? Well, Canada's kind of like New York or Vermont or New Hampshire. You know, it's more north-south differences than Canada-U.S. differences. I mean, I married a Canadian, and so I knew they weren't all that different. We could talk and actually communicate. I never considered going to Canada, going to the mission field in the sense of leaving a culture, learning another language, putting together a partnership team, and going to another part of the world. I just drove. It's one tank of gas to get to Canada. One tank of gas and you can be in Ontario from here. I know because we crossed the border once driving a Buick LeSabre at Christmas. We filled up and crossed the border and we coasted off the Beltway onto Braddock Road with fumes, keeping the car going. We made it all the way to Braddock Road on one tank of gas. I never considered that we went transculturally to the mission field, but I was willing to. I surrendered to whatever God wanted. I prepared to do that very thing, and God had other plans, and we ended up planning, as you know, a church in Canada and then Community Baptist. What I saw as a boy with my eyes, week after week and month after month, shaped my life. My eyes affected my heart. When you come into Community Baptist Church for the next 12 months, every time you walk in the front door, if you ever walk in the front door, some of you only walk in the back door, but if you ever walk in the front door and you look up, you'll see, 3 foot by 15 foot? Huh? 40 foot? 40 foot wide banner that asks you a question. What does your heart see? And that is a question that I hope we will pray and think about and meditate on this year regarding missions. What does my heart see? And may what I see impact my heart for souls all over the world. Jesus Christ was moved with compassion when he saw the multitudes. And then he encouraged his followers to pray to the Lord of the harvest, to send forth laborers all over the world to take the gospel of Jesus Christ to the ends of the earth. It's when he saw that he was moved with compassion, and then he acted on that compassion by motivating, putting in movement the greatest missionary force the world's ever known, New Testament Christianity, going to all the world and evangelizing and planting churches that will in turn send out missionaries to other countries and plant churches, who will in turn send out missionaries to other countries to plant churches. And for 2,000 years, the great missionary enterprise was birthed in the heart of Jesus Christ and is extended to the ends of the earth by what we see impacting our hearts, shaping our lives. God help us as we listen to these missionaries next week to see and feel a burden for the world. Thank you for joining us for part of a Sunday service at Community Baptist Church. I hope to meet you soon. May God impress His love upon your heart this week.